I'm a search and rescue officer with the US Forest Service, and along the way, I've seen some things I can't explain. Story 1. As far as missing persons go, I'd say about half the calls I get are related to that. The other are rescue calls, people who fall down cliffs and hurt themselves, get injured by fire, which is usually drunk kids, or get bitten or stung by animals and insects. We're a tight team, and we have veterans who are excellent at finding signs of lost people. That's what makes these cases where we never find any trace of them so frustrating. One in particular was upsetting for all of us, because we did find a trace of them, but it just led to more questions than answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a well-established trail, but his wife called to say that he hadn't come home when he should have. Apparently, he had a history of seizures, and she was worried that he hadn't taken his medication and had suffered one out on the trail. I have no idea why he thought it was a good idea to go out alone, or why she didn't go with him. I don't ask that kind of thing, because past a certain point, it doesn't really matter. Someone is missing, and it's my job to find them. We went out in standard search formation, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found signs that the guy had in fact gone off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan to make sure we were covering as much ground as possible. Suddenly, a call comes from over the radio telling us all to head back to the vet's location. We come right away because this usually means the missing person is injured, and we'll need a full team to get them out safely. We meet back up, and the vet is just standing at the base of the tree with his hands on the side of his head. I ask my buddy what's going on, and he points up into the branches of this tree. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing, but there's a walking stick dangling from a branch at least 30 feet off the ground. The little strap on the handle had been looped around the branch, and it's just hanging there. There's no way this elderly gentleman could have tossed it up that far, and we don't see any signs that he's still in the area. We call up into the tree, but it's obvious no one's in it. So we're all just sort of left scratching our heads. We keep searching for the guy, but we never find him. We even bring our canines out, but they lose his scent long before the tree. Eventually, the search is called off because there are other calls we have to attend to, and past a certain point, there's not a whole heck of a lot we can do. The guy's wife called us every day for months, asking if we'd found her husband, and it was heartbreaking to hear her get more and more hopeless each time. I'm not sure why this call in particular was so upsetting, but I think it was just the sheer improbability of it. That, and the questions that were raised. How the hell did this guy's cane end up there? Did someone kill him and toss it up there as some sort of weird trophy? We did our best to find him, but it was almost like a taunt. And from time to time, the team still talks about this one, but we can never figure it out. Story 2. Missing kids are the most heartbreaking. It doesn't matter what circumstances they go missing under, it's never easy. And we always dread the ones we find deceased. It's not common, but it does happen. David Paulides talks a lot about kids search and rescue teams find in places they shouldn't be or couldn't have gotten to. I can honestly say I've heard about this kind of thing happening more than I've seen it, but I'll share one of the ones that I think a lot about that I personally witnessed. A mother and her 3 kids were out for a picnic in an area of the park that has a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, and the other is about 3. She's watching them all very closely, and according to her, she never let them out of her sight at any point in time. She never saw anyone else in the area either, which is an important detail. When it's time to go, she packs up their stuff, and they start to head back to the parking area. Now, this lake is only about 2 miles into the woods, and it's on very clearly established trails. It's almost impossible to get lost from the parking area to it, unless you go off the path deliberately. So as this mother and her kids are walking to the campsite, her kids are walking in front of her, and she hears what sounds like someone coming up the path behind her, so she turns around, and in the 4 or so seconds she's not looking, her 5-year-old son vanishes. She figured he stepped off the path to go pee or something, so she turns to her kids and asks where he went. They both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand, and led him into the trees. Her 2 remaining kids don't seem upset. In fact, she says later that it seemed like they'd been drugged. They're sort of spacey and fuzzy, so of course she's freaking out. She starts looking frantically in the area for her kid. She's screaming his name, and she says at one point she thinks she heard him answer. Now, obviously, she can't go blindly running into the woods. She's got 2 other kids, so she calls the police and they send us out immediately. We respond and we start the search for him. Over the course of this search, which spans miles, we never find a single trace of the kid. Canines can't pick up any scent, we don't find any clothing or broken bushes or literally anything that would signify a child being there, or anyone being there. Of course, there's suspicion about the mother for a while, but it's pretty clear that she's completely destroyed by the whole thing. We looked for this kid for weeks, with a lot of volunteer help, but eventually the search peters out and we have to move on. The volunteers keep searching though, and one day we get a call on the radio letting us know that a body has been found and needs to be recovered. They tell us the location, and none of us can believe it. We figure it has to be a different kid, but we go there about 15 miles from the site where he vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the kid we've been looking for. I have been trying to figure out how this kid got where he did ever since we found him, and I've never come up with an answer. A volunteer just happened to be in the area because he figured he might as well look in places no one else would think to on the off chance a body had been dumped. He comes to the base of a tall tree, rocky slope halfway up, and he sees something. He looks through his binoculars and, sure enough, it's the body of that little boy, stuffed in the opening in a rock. He recognizes the color of the kid's shirt, so he knows right away that it is the same boy. That's when he calls it in, and we get dispatched. It took us almost an hour to get his body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 miles from where he'd started, there was no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. We had a hard enough time, and it's part of our job to be able to get to places like this. And not only is the location weird, but the kid doesn't have a scratch on him. His shoes are gone, but his feet aren't damaged or dirty. It was as if an animal dragged him up there, and from what I can tell, he hadn't been dead that long. He'd been out there for over a month by that point, and it looked like he'd only been dead for, at most, a day or two. The whole thing was unbelievably strange, and was one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever been on. We found out later that the coroner determined that the kid had died from exposure. He'd frozen to death. Probably late at night, 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects and no answers. To date, it's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. Story 3. One of my first jobs as a trainee was a search op for a 4-year-old kid that had gotten separated from his mom. This was one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him because the dogs were on a strong scent trail, and we saw clear signs that he was in the area. We ended up finding him in a berry patch about half a mile from where he'd been last seen. Kid wasn't even aware that he'd wandered that far. One of the vets brought him back, which I was glad for because I'm really not good with kids, and I find it hard to talk to them and keep them company. As my trainer and I are headed back, she decides to take me on a detour to show me one of the hot spots where we tend to find missing people. It's a natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people will usually move downhill because it's easier. We hike out there, it's a few miles away, and we get there in about an hour or so. As we're walking around the area, she's pointing out places she's found people in the past. I see something in the distance. Now, this area we're in is about 8 miles from the main parking area, though there's back roads you can take to get closer if you don't want to hike that far. But we're on state-protected land, which means there can't be any kind of commercial or residential development there. The most you'll ever see is a fire tower or a makeshift shelter that homeless people think they can get away with building. But I can see from here that whatever this thing is has straight edges, and if there's one thing you learn quickly, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I point it out, but she doesn't say anything. She just hangs back and lets me wander over to check it out. I get within about 20 feet of it, and all the hair on the back of my neck stands straight up. It's a staircase. In the middle of the fucking woods. In the proper context, it would literally be the most benign thing ever. It's just a normal staircase with beige carpet and about 10 steps tall. But instead of being in a house, where it obviously should be, it's out here in the middle of the woods. The sides aren't carpeted, obviously, and I can see the wood it's made of. It's almost like a video game glitch, where the house has failed to load completely and the stairs are the only thing visible. I stand there, and it's like my brain is working overtime to try and make sense of what I'm seeing. My trainer comes and stands next to me, and she just stands there casually, looking at it as if it's the least interesting thing in the world. I ask her, "What in the world is this doing here?" And she chuckles. "Get used to it, rookie. You're gonna see a lot of them." I start moving closer, but she grabs my arm. Hard. "I wouldn't do that," she says. Her voice is casual, but her grip is tight. And I just stand there looking at her. "You're gonna see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them. Don't go up them. Just ignore them." I start to ask her about it, but something in the way she's looking at me tells me that it's best if I don't. We end up moving on, and the subject doesn't come up again for the rest of my training. She was right though. I'd say about every 5th call I go on, I end up running across a set of stairs. Sometimes they're relatively close to the path, maybe within 2 or 3 miles. Sometimes they're 20, 30 miles out, literally in the middle of nowhere. And I only find them during the broadest searches or training weekends. They're usually in pretty good condition, but sometimes it looks like they've been out there for decades. All different kinds, all different sizes. The biggest I ever saw looked like they came out of a turn-of-the-century mansion and were at least 10 feet wide. I've tried talking about it with people, but they just give me the same response my trainer did. "It's normal. Don't worry about it. They're not a big deal, but just don't go close to them or up them." When trainees ask me about it now, I give them the same response. I don't really know what else to tell them. I'm really hoping someday I get a better answer, but it hasn't happened yet. Story 4. This is another one that was less spooky and more sad. A young man went missing late in winter, when realistically no one should have been going out that far onto the trails. We close a lot of them, but some remain open year-round, unless there's a shitload of snow. We didn't opt for him, but we had about 6 feet of snow on the ground, which was an unusually heavy amount for that time of year. We knew it wasn't likely that we'd find him until spring when the thaw came, and sure enough, when the big thaw came, a hiker reported a body a little ways off the main trail. We found him at the base of a tree, in a pile of melted snow. I knew right away what had happened, and it scared the living shit out of me. Most of you who ski or snowboard, or spend any amount of time in the mountains, will probably have guessed what happened. When the snow falls, it doesn't collect as thick in areas beneath the branches. It happens most with fir trees because they have a sort of closed umbrella shape. So what you end up with is a space around the base of the tree filled with a mixture of loose, powdery snow, air, and branches. It's what's called tree wells, and they're not immediately obvious if you don't know what you're looking for. We put up signs in the welcome center, big ones, letting people know how dangerous they are. But every year that we get an unusual amount of snow, at least one person doesn't read them or doesn't take the warning seriously, and we find out about it in spring. My best guess is that this young man was hiking and got tired, or maybe a cramp from walking in the deep snow. He went to go sit at the base of a tree, not knowing that there was a tree well, and fell in. He got stuck with his feet up in the air, and the surrounding snow caved in around him. Unable to free himself, he suffocated. It's called snow immersion suffocation, and it doesn't usually happen except in really deep snow. But if you get stuck in a weird position, like this guy did, even 6 feet of snow can be lethal. What scared me the most was imagining how he must have struggled, upside down in the freezing cold. He didn't die quickly. The snow would have formed a dense, heavy pile on top of him, and it would have been literally impossible to get out, like being entombed in ice. As it got harder to breathe, he would have known what was happening. I can't even imagine what he was thinking in his last moments. Story 5. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen the Goat Man while I've been out on calls. Unfortunately, or fortunately rather, I've never had anything quite like that happen. I guess the closest was the whole black-eyed man thing, but I didn't see anything myself. However, there was one call where I had something kind of similar happen, but I'm not sure I'm willing to chalk it up to being the Goat Man. We'd gotten a report that an older woman had fainted along one of the trails and needed assistance getting back down to the main area. We hiked up to where she's at, and her husband is just beside himself. He runs up to us and tells us that he was a little ways off the trail looking at something when his wife starts screaming at him. He runs back to her and she's passed out on the trail. We get her on a backboard, and as we're getting her down to the welcome center, she comes to and starts screaming again. I calm her down and ask what happened. I can't remember verbatim what she said, but essentially what happened was this. She'd been waiting for her husband when she started hearing this really strange sound. She said the closer it got, the more uneasy she was, until she finally figured out what was wrong. I do remember this next part because it was so weird that I don't think I could forget it if I tried. But she said that there was a man saying the word meow over and over, just meow, meow, meow. But it wasn't a man. It couldn't have been, because I've never heard a man make his voice buzz like that. At first, I thought it was my hearing aid going out, but it wasn't. I adjusted it and it still sounded all buzzy. It was awful. He was coming closer, but I couldn't see him, and the closer he got, the more scared I was. The last thing I remember was a shape coming out of the trees, and I guess that's when I fainted. Now, obviously, I'm a little perplexed as to why a guy would be out in the woods chanting meow meow at people. So, once we get down the mountain, I tell my superior that I'm going to go search the area and see if I can find anything. He gives me the go-ahead, and I grab a radio and hike back to where she fainted. I don't see anyone, so I keep going about a mile more, and when I head back, I go off the trail to see if I can maybe figure out where she saw him coming from. It's almost sunset by this point, and I don't have any desire to be out at night alone, so I just sort of write it off and make a mental note to check it out again tomorrow. As I'm headed back though, I start to hear something in the distance. I stop and call out to anyone in the immediate area to identify themselves. The sound didn't come closer or get louder, but it sounded exactly like a man saying meow in this really odd monotone. I go off the trail in the direction I think it's coming from, but I never seem to get closer. It's almost like it's coming from all directions, and eventually it just sort of fades out. I ended up going back to the Welcome Center and didn't get any further reports like that. And even though I went back to that area, I never heard the exact sound again. I suppose it could have been some stupid kid out there fucking with people, but even I have to admit, it was weird. This has been part 2 of a multi-part series. I believe from the looks of it, we are going to get to all 6 parts. Make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see those, and now I've got a few stories of my own to tell. First and foremost, stories of otherworldly creatures such as fae, demons, etc. have always been passed down through generations amongst forest-dwelling tribes and colonists. In fact, even today, my friends up north who grew up in the country have told me a well-known rule that parents teach their children. If you ever go exploring in the woods, don't linger, don't stay out after dark. If you hear voices, assume it's poachers and don't engage. Keep your eyes forward and do not scan around you. Make your way back home quick, but don't run. And if you feel you're being watched, listen, don't look. From what I understand, a lot of native and pagan cultures had similar rules for exploring the woods as well, although oftentimes they would tell it in stories as opposed to a direct, here's the rules, you must follow them. And this next story I have is a personal one from my mother regarding tree wells like in story 4. She was out on a ski trip with her boyfriend at the time, and he took her down a path more difficult than she was ready for, and she wasn't able to keep enough speed in the trees. It was fresh powder, and she was so busy trying to keep up that she got a bit too close to a tree and slipped into the well. Her boyfriend couldn't hear her calling out, and he went back to the lodge to party with the group they came with. My mom spent the next 5 hours trying to climb out of that well, essentially reverse avalanche digging herself out. For those of you who aren't familiar, in an avalanche situation, you dig a somewhat horizontal path to the person so that you don't stick a thin steel shovel through their arm. And she basically did the same thing, but from inside using her skis and hands to get out. Trouble is, you have limited space in that well to store the snow you're digging, and she didn't have the strength to throw the snow up and over the path she was making for herself. She got lucky that she was able to make it out alive, part of which was because she fell in upright, unlike the man in the story. But a lot of people, especially folks not dressed for the weather, panic and try to scramble their way out. What ends up happening is they tire themselves out and become covered in sweat, which starts to freeze. Hypothermia sets in, and they eventually go into shock. The inside of that tree well becomes the last thing they ever see. Scary shit can happen in the woods sometimes, and the deeper you go, the less chance of help there is. Now, if you guys liked this content and want to see part 3, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. I should have part 3 out tomorrow, and I will be making a playlist for all of these. Also, leave your Deep Woods experience story in the comments below. I'd love to see them and maybe make another video on the stories from these videos. I've never really been one to tell campfire stories and horror stories, which is probably at least a little obvious in this video. And it's a lot of fun, so I'm looking forward to making more of these videos. I'm ReddList. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day or night, and I will see you next time.